In Victoria, we have several infrastructure evaluation vehicles that patrol the rail network, getting data on track geometry, such as the current vehicle IEV120, EV. However, in the past, EV didn't exist. So how was infrastructure surveyed and maintained? Well, that's what I'm going to cover in this video, as well as some of the other interesting pieces of service stock. Way and Works. So what is a Way and Works? Well, in the Victorian Railways case, Way and Works was one of the operational branches of the VR. The branch was headed by the Chief Civil Engineer. The Way and Works constructed and maintained all infrastructure, tracks, bridges, stations, signalling, and safe working, as well as infrastructure planning and design. So all the historic railway drawings I use in my videos were pretty much all drawn by this department. They also made instruction manuals on repairing the rail line. It wasn't really formed, it kind of always existed. The earliest trace of the Way and Works department was the establishment of the Department of Railways in 1858 to manage all railway infrastructure in the state. In the early days, the Department of Railways usually didn't construct rail lines. Instead, they hired construction out to private companies. In 1903, the branch, Engineering for Existing Lines, was officially renamed the Way and Works branch. The Spotswood Railway Workshops was opened in 1927. It's also known as the Way and Works Workshop, and this is where the Way and Works was based out of for many years. The building was designed by James Fawcett, and it's actually still there today. The workshops were the main place for railway maintenance and were a busy place during the interwar years of railway construction. The workshops closed on the 23rd of December 1980, with the declining amount of rail lines in the state. So why do I mention the Way and Works department? Well, most of the rolling stock mentioned in this video was used by the Way and Works department in some way. Otherwise, the other rolling stock mentioned in this video would be managed by the rolling stock department, which is exactly what it sounds like. It oversaw the design, construction, and maintenance of all locomotives and rolling stock. Greasers. Possibly the most famous of the work stock on the Victorian medals, the greaser train wasn't just two famous Harris cars. There was also a Tate inspection car and a few vans. Let's start with the Tate. The Tate overhead inspection car was converted from a Tate motor, 447M. 447M was taken out of service in 1979, and it had a short stay in storage. After a few months, it was taken out of storage and shipped off to Newport workshops to be converted to a greasing and overhead inspection car, with an extra 2 pantographs fitted and an observation cupola added. Overhead inspection started in 1981, with the car having overhead inspection slapped on the side. Before the Harris greasers were converted to be, well, greasers, the Tate was just slapped in between a few normal Tates. The car was fitted with a generator and hydraulic equipment, which injected grease lubricant onto the panto, which then smeared grease onto the overhead wires. Although grease tended to fall off the panto, so catch pans were installed. It was renamed 1447 in 1983, similar to the rest of the Tate fleet. By 1985, the process of randomly selecting a Tate car was no longer an option, as the last of the Tates were withdrawn. So, with the withdrawal of the Harris trains around the same time, 2 of the asbestos-free second series Harrises, 794M and 797M, were both painted bright yellow with met stripes, their interiors were removed, and they were added to the consist. The Harris cars greased the inside of the rail and wheel flanges, which would reduce flange wear on train wheels. However, the Tates had screw couplers, and the Harris cars had auto couplers. So, V-Line was nice enough to lease 2 D-vans to use as transitional couplers, 320 and 329. The Combench and Hitachi fleet had graphite strips placed along the pantos, which significantly reduced friction, and after the withdrawal of the last of the Harris sets in early 1990, greasing the overhead was no longer required. So in most photos of 447M, it had its pantograph down, and it was used only to inspect the overhead from that point on, as well as acting as a crew car. However, the Harrises kept being used to grease wheel flanges, running alone after 1995. They were used until the early 2000s, until automatic oil pots were installed all over the network. You can see some which have just exploded everywhere. A car that I didn't mention was 3CM, which actually did the job before the Tate, from 1977 to 1980. Funnily enough, it was converted from a parcel van, which was a converted Tate car. It basically did the same exact thing as the Tate, just it was self-propelled. However, before specialized trains, the way that the wires were greased was through manual greasing. Yes, it is as painful as it sounds, manually spreading the paste across the wire or on a specific point of the wire. all 3 important carriages survived into preservation. However, after space was needed at Newport workshops in 2008 and 9, 447M was disposed of. Fortunately, the Harris Greasers still survive, even getting a facelift in 2022, and they are some of the last Harris motors in preservation. Weedex. To keep the tracks clean and without weeds, a train would run across all rail lines in Victoria and spray weed poison on the tracks. Without it, the tracks would look like this. So the first Weedex trains aren't what you would expect. This Weedex train is probably the more familiar version to you guys. However, before this, there were 7 motorized trolleys hooked up to a trailer with a spray unit and a 400-gallon tank. The whole thing was powered by a 4-horsepower engine. It could do 1 to 4 miles of track at a time, at a speed of 10 miles an hour. Very inefficient and much more prone to human error. So in July 1955, the first proper Weedex train ran, departing from Ballarat, starting on the 11th of July 1955 and reaching Yalta by the 13th. This consist had a louver van, 2 crew cars, a few 4-wheel tankers, 2 of them filled with Weedex solution and another 3 with either concentrate or water, and the star of the show, the sprayer and mixing wagon itself. It could run up to 20 miles an hour when it was at max weight, and it could treat as much as 200 miles of track. The louver vans were used for chemical storage, and were just your stock standard louver vans. The chemicals will be mixed with the water inside the tankers to create even more solution. The crew cars were converted from 2 horse vans, F61 and F46, and they were numbered HW1 and HW2. In the late 1950s, after the VR was converting all of their rolling stock from screw to auto couplers, the bodies of HW1 and 2 were lifted off their frames and placed on bogie horse box underframes. This is why the carriage doesn't quite look like the other bogie horse wagons. This won't be the last time I talk about horse vans in this video. Moving on to the tank wagons, these things were introduced in 1950 to 51, and they are actually withdrawn I wagons, with the bodies chopped off and tanks added. After the rebuild, they were recoded WX wagons. However, they retained their I wagon numbers. After the Weedex train started running, a further 25, 1 to 25, were put into service between 1950 and 59. 9 wagons had extra capacity, as they were built using E-open wagon underframes. The rest of them were identical to the first batch. The new ones were actually supposed to replace the existing ones. All the originals were gone by 1959. Numbers 10 to 19 were actually permanently paired up with their adjacent numbers, and they were also all scrapped by 59. In 1963, all of the WX wagons were recoded to WAs, and the remaining fixed wagons, 20 to 25, were all scrapped or stored by 1979, with the exception of one, W22, which was converted to a liquid fertilizer tank. The final wagon in the original consist was the sprayer van itself. It also was converted from a horse van and renumbered to HZ1. It finished conversion in December 1954 and was fitted with pumps and spray nozzles to spray around and the track itself. It also had pipes and other things to carry the poison from the tankers to the wagon. It was recoded to WZ in 1959, as a new variety of open wagon had taken HZ. The Weedex train toured every line in Vic every 2 to 3 years, killing all plant life near and around the tracks. Over the next few decades, the Weedex train got a few upgrades. By the 70s, another brake van was added at the other end of the Weedex van, to allow more efficiency turning around. In 1971, HW1 was replaced by a passenger car, A37. The old HW1 was kept in storage until 1978, when it was scrapped. In 1982, the most impressive of all, the Weedex van itself was replaced. ZL497 was rebuilt and renumbered to WZ2, equipped with spray equipment and painted a ghostly white. It was used from 1982 onwards, and WZ1 was placed into storage at Newport workshops, where it remained until 1996 when it was disposed of. In the early 2000s, with road rail vehicles being cheaper, environmental concerns raged on, and aging rolling stock, the trains ceased. The Weedex van was last seen at Echuca, and it might still be there today, although it is in a really poor state. Dynamometer and Dynograph. Most people who watch this channel would know what a dynamometer car is, but for those who don't know, Wikipedia says a dynamometer is a device for simultaneously measuring the torque and rotational speed of an engine, motor, or other rotating prime mover, so that its instantaneous power may be calculated, and usually displayed by the dynamometer itself as kilowatts or horsepower. And the Dynamometer car did just that. However, before the Dynamometer existed, there was a device called a Dynograph, which basically did the same exact thing, but much more primitive. The VR's Dynograph had originally been built in 1858 as passenger car 69A. In 1890, the car was marked for departmental use, and it was converted to a Dynograph in 1896. Apparently, in that 6-year window before conversion, it was noted as being the governor's car. The Dynograph car was very small, and was used to only test the tractive effort of locomotives. It was superseded by the Dynamometer car when that was introduced in the 30s, which was bigger and could do much more. The Dynograph was put into storage at Newport workshops for the remainder of the 40s. Rail staff wanted the car preserved. Despite the staff bargaining, scrapping was ultimately up to the people at head office, and the car was scrapped in 1953. The Dynamometer, which superseded it, was a shared carriage between both the VR and the SAR, and was part of their joint rolling stock list. The car was built in 1932 at Islington workshops from the remains of carriages and mail vans destroyed in the Callington derailment on the 27th of December 1929, where a Melbourne to Adelaide Express derailed. Just by looking at it, you can tell it's very non-standard. Mersers Alfred J. Amler and Company of Switzerland supplied the recording instruments inside the car. All forces acting on the coupler were transmitted to a hydraulic dynamometer situated below the floor. Fluids then travel through the pipe spaghetti and valves to the measuring apparatus. All tests are then recorded on paper. Entering the car, it only had a vestibule at one end, with a wash sink to protect the main instrument room from dust and dirt. The instrument room had the main table, operator's writing desk, and an examination table to study the charts. Connected to the instrument room is a conference room and a small workshop, with a small kitchen and toilet making up the rest of the carriage. By the mid-60s, it was repainted yellow, although other sources tell me it was repainted in 1945. It was used regularly by the Victorian Railways until the 1950s, testing its massive steam locomotives, notably being used on the X-32 pulverized brown coal tests, as well as being used on the S-Class Pacifics, and even comparing the Tates and Harris EMUs, with the car logging up to 900 tests in its career. After the 1950s, it was stored except for the rare run here and there. It wasn't used at all from 1972 to 1982. One of its last tests ever was testing radio reception for the installation of train-to-base radio, and alternative safe working, a radio-based safe working system. Australian National acquired the carriage soon after, but loaned it to V-Line in the early 80s. In 1993, the Dynamometer was given to the Port Dock Station Railway Museum, but it was kept in Victoria for a few more years in the care of the Seymour Rail Heritage Centre. It left Seymour in April 1995 and was transferred to the museum. The car had experienced a lot of water damage in its lifetime, and to get it back to its original glory, extensive restoration works were carried out by the Railway Museum. And it's on display today, looking much better than it did in the 1980s. Workman vehicles. Remember the Way and Works department I talked about earlier? When they were out building a railway or maintaining a railway, they would bring a few of these wagons. What were these? Well, they were basically a mobile house on wheels. The Victorian Railways maintained and repaired infrastructure using repair gangs, which were able to go statewide. These gangs stayed in these carriages as long as they needed to complete the repairs, with basic living amenities built into them, before they moved to another area. This is why most of them had some form of shunt carefully not to be loose shunted written in bold letters, as it was a 50-50 gamble to whether these cars were empty or had people inside. Let's start with the most common of these wagons. Workman sleepers. Oh boy, these things are weird. Over 240 of these things were built, and you could find them all around the state. There were three kinds of sleepers. These four-wheel sleepers were purpose-built first in 1910, which the DSCR seems to have a collection of. Another variant was long redundant four-wheel passenger cars that were rebuilt to be sleepers, like this one. And the final variant, which was a bogie passenger car chopped in two and slapped on a four-wheel underframe. However, they weren't all built in one go. More were built in 1911, 1914, 1928-29, 1934, 1936-37, 1943, 1945, and 1958-60, with conversion of other carriages occurring during these years or intermediate years. A lot of the repurposed ones were extremely weird, with some original panels and new metal ones put in place of ones which were too extensively damaged. There were also really Frankenstein ones which had all of their wooden exterior panels completely replaced with metal. As said before, they were basically mobile houses which could be transported wherever workers were working, and employees would usually call them bug huts. Each one could hold 4 souls, and the area in between the door had a sink, table, and stove. From 1958 onwards, they were all fitted with electrical lighting, replacing the oil lamps. Things got really lavish when most of them got gas-powered refrigerators. And you can see the small doors where the gas cartridges were replaced. They were used all the way until the late 70s, where road transported sleepers began to be cheaper. WW Workman sleepers. So what's the difference between these and the single Ws? Well, the main difference is that these were rebuilt bogie coaches as opposed to fixed wheel coaches, although new build bogies do exist. So everything about these is just much cooler than the small Ws. 171 of these were built or converted. The Victorian RAAF recruiting train was converted from converted WW passenger cars. The selected carriages were painted blue and used their original codes. When the recruiting train ceased, the cars were recoded back to WW, although they did keep the blue color scheme into the 1950s until they were slowly picked off with repaints during routine maintenance. A lot of the fixed wheeled coaches couldn't be converted to use auto couplers, so the underframes from scrapped bogie wagons and carriages were cut down, the sleeper bodies were put on the frames, and then the carriages could be auto coupled. At first they were classified as W Workman sleepers, but before they re-entered service, they were changed to WWs. There were a few interesting carriages, but the most interesting in my opinion was WW77. This was the last of the joint passenger stock used on the first overland run between Melbourne and Adelaide. It surprisingly lasted in service until the 1950s, and then it was converted to a sleeper in 1959. It was stored in 1976, and it's almost certainly been scrapped since then. WS Workman showers. There were 6 of these in total. They were converted from the first class end of off-register AB carriages in 1959. They were built for the Sydney Main Line standardization project, although none of them were actually ever on standard gauge. They were also used in areas which pretty much had nothing. They each had 6 showers and sinks, with 4 380-litre tanks mounted on the roof, feeding the showers with water. Interestingly, there was a boiler inside a wooden carriage. Granted, the sides were panelled over using those metal sheets again, but one of the ends was still wood. And WS3 did have a small boo-boo when the fire was no longer inside the boiler. They lasted in service until the 1980s before being withdrawn and scrapped. WK Workman kitchens and WM dining vans. There was only one carriage ever converted to be a kitchen, WK1, formerly known as AA272. It was loaned to the SAR from 1942 to 44. In 1951, it was withdrawn from revenue service and converted to be a kitchen car in 1959 or 61. There's conflicting sources again. It also looks nothing like its heritage, and it was almost certainly converted to assist with the conversion of the Northeast Main Line, so it would have joined the WS cars and the other sleepers. It had a kitchen, table, and room to feed 25 workers. By the late 70s, it was welded to the rails and forced to stay in one spot next to the Spencer Street car sheds. The body was eventually sold off, and now it sits in a field in Wonthaggi. The WM dining vans were pretty much the same thing. 2 horse boxes were converted to mess cars, with the installation of long tables for eating. WM1 was converted from F32 in 1952, and WM2 was converted from F38 in 1952. In 1969, WM1 was recoded to HD231, which is why you don't really see any photos of it. They were both scrapped around the same time as the W sleepers, as they no longer had any worker trains to follow around. Medical vision cars. The first medical vision car came around in July 1924, and honestly, its car's history is so weird. I would say out of all the pieces of rolling stock I've mentioned today, this is definitely the weirdest. The first trace of the car or cars was in 1880, and at first it was actually 2 cars, Ministerial 1 and Ministerial 2. 1 was originally numbered A68 and 2 was originally numbered A67, both being 4-wheel fixed-wheel coaches. In 1891, both of them were modified to have a single bogie only at one end. Ministerial 1 ran as State Car from 1892 and Ministerial 2 ran as Ministerial. For all trains, they were coupled to each other in a semi-permanent fashion, axle bogie, which is really weird. Then the cars were combined into one carriage, with an updated interior and a full bogie underframe. The two cars were renamed to Edinburgh. In December 1910, the car was renamed again to Mitter, not to be confused with the other Mitter, which was a Spirit of Progress buffet car. Although, for a few months, both carriages did coexist, until Mitter Edinburgh was scrapped. Mitter Edinburgh was converted once more to a vision test car in July 1924. The car, like the name suggests, tested the vision of key railway personnel in rural locations. Train drivers, guards, signalmen, shunters, and track workers. It was a win-win situation. Railway staff didn't need to travel to major cities to get a checkup, and it improved railway safety by only allowing medically fit staff to operate trains. The car had a main examination room with eye charts, adjustable lighting, and seating, a dark room to simulate night or poor lighting conditions, a waiting area for staff to be queued to be tested, and small quarters for the traveling medical doctors, including a bed and desk. Like a true mobile optometrist. However, after 15 years in this state, it was scrapped in May 1939. But the need for eyesight testing was still prevalent, so the successor to the vision car was the medical and vision car. It was converted from one of the E-type dining carriages, Glimmer. Glimmer was built in December 1908, along with its sisters Goulburn and Campaspe. It did the dining car thing for a while, before being converted to a medical and vision car in October 1938. Tours were hindered by wartime rationing. However, after the war, the car started doing regular solo trips all around the state, giving railway staff a 10 to 20 minute checkup, while also doing vision tests. This car was more of a general medical office, also checking blood pressure, hearing, mobility, and general fitness. This car also included the revolutionary things of water, gas, and electricity. The car toured the state for an impressive 40 years before being withdrawn from service in 1981. It was actually converted back to a dining car and re-entered service in August 1988, painted blue and yellow. And it's currently at Newport Railway Museum. There was a proposed dental train similar to the medical vision car, although it never happened. It would have operated in a similar fashion to the medical vision car, maybe even on the same consist. Hospital cars. After the worst railway accident in Victorian history occurred, involving a passenger train colliding into the back of another passenger train, resulting in 400 deaths and injuries, the Victorian Railways wanted a quick response train to help assist with the care of injured people in case of another railway accident. Two carriages were converted for this purpose, second-class passenger carriages B328 and B343, both dated from 1883. They entered service in December 1909, fitted with water, stretchers, rest beds, and medical supplies. They didn't have a number, and even to this day, they are just known as Hospital Cars 1 and 2 respectively. They didn't seem to get much use. In fact, they were scrapped a few decades later. Car 2 was scrapped first in 1939, and the body sits in a field at Lake Goldsmith. Car 1 was scrapped in 1940. Its body was sold and sent to Somerton until about 1949, when it was moved again to Buller. Not sure if either bodies are still there. They were still there in 1999. In the spirit of the hospital cars, during World War II a few carriages were converted to be hospital cars to assist with the war effort. They were used to treat wounded servicemen who were arriving back to Victorian ports, and were used to transport them back to other states and to inland military or civilian hospitals. Australia is a vast country, and hospital trains were essential for moving patients comfortably over long distances. It was a no-brainer as roads weren't developed and airplanes were poor at moving mass amounts of people. The first carriage converted was a BPL carriage, number 82. You know, those default looking passenger cars on the VR. It was withdrawn from service in 1939, and its interior got a complete makeover, with all the seating removed and 13 triple-decker bunk beds replacing them. Enough capacity for 39 patients. It also had medical equipment and facilities for doctors and nurses. Externally, it was painted in the same grey that the current preservation Tates have around their windows, and all windows, besides the doors, got white accents. The carriage got covered with the universal sign for medic, the red cross with white circle. There was a massive one painted on the roof and a few smaller ones on the side. The car was very useful, and an extra 10 BPL carriages were refitted in the same fashion, although they only had 12 triple-decker bunk beds rather than 13. They also gained 24 lockers for patients' personal belongings. It's also unclear whether 82 BPL had lockers or not, and if so, the quantity. One of the converted carriages, 57 BPL, was converted to a staff car as well. These cars either ran as one 11-car consist or one hospital car tagged on the end of 10 normal BPL carriages. The troop trains ran to a few major Victorian towns, Albury, Tocumwal, Serviceton and Bairnsdale, to drop off troops. However, eventually they made their way to the South Australian network, which had a lot more going on in terms of the war effort, running to Tarawi and Port Pirie. After the war, the hospital cars weren't needed anymore, and they might have returned to service. However, with the amount of PL cars there were, it's unlikely, so they probably would have been stored. The cars were later converted to the Jubilee train in 1950-51, which was a display of all the achievements Australia had made in the 50 years since Federation. This required completely empty car bodies, so all the insides were gutted out of each carriage and the outside was painted green and gold. I've also talked about the Jubilee train in another video, and I'll send you over to this video about the N class for more information. Hello all, I hope you liked this video. I definitely had a blast researching this one. In another video, I'll go through some of the weird cranes that the Victorian Railways had. To not miss it, make sure you're subscribed. If you want a place to hang out, you should join my Discord. And if you want to support me further, you should join my Patreon. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you later.